Welcome to True Echo, where real justice finds a voice. Today's story isn't just about power, it's about what happens when silence is broken, dignity is restored, and a system built on prejudice is forced to face the truth. This is the story of a woman stripped of her identity, only to rise not as a victim but as the very embodiment of justice. What happened behind the cold walls of Lexington Federal Courthouse was never meant to be known. But today we echo the truth. The Lexington Federal Courthouse buzzed like any other weekday morning, metal detectors humming, voices echoing against marble walls, and the shuffle of papers and shoes in hurried rhythms. No one paused. No one noticed the silver-haired woman in a charcoal gray coat walking alone through the main entrance. Her name was Judge Alexandria Rhodess, 52 years old, known for her deep convictions and an unshakable calm that had unnerved many a crooked lawyer in her courtroom. But today she wasn't wearing her robe. No security escort, no formal fanfare. Just a woman in navy slacks, a leather satchel slung at her side, and eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by the surface of civility. She walked with purpose, her curls neatly pinned, her gait straight and strong. Until it wasn't. "Excuse me, ma'am?" The voice was sharp, condescending. Deputy Colleen Briggs stood at the security checkpoint, arms folded. Tall, blonde, and visibly enjoying the power her badge gave her, she looked at Alexandria the way someone might assess a suspect on a street corner. Alexandria offered her judicial ID, gold-sealed and well-worn from years of use. Colleen didn't look. She snatched it and pocketed it like confiscated contraband. "No badge, no entry," she barked. Alexandria raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Years on the bench had taught her not to escalate, especially when facing someone who thrived on intimidation. But what came next shocked even her. "You match the profile," Colleen said loudly, turning to the others nearby. "Big hair like that? Could be hiding anything. Random check." There was no protocol for what followed. No probable cause. No warrant. No official paperwork. Just Colleen dragging Alexandria down a side corridor past young officers who looked the other way, their eyes screaming discomfort but their mouths sealed shut. The hallway ended in a steel door labeled Room C, Secondary Screening. The room was cold. Gray walls, a single chair, and a tray of inspection tools laid out like surgical instruments. Among them, electric clippers buzzing low and ominous. Colleen pulled on gloves. "You know, people hide things in curly hair all the time. Weapons, drugs, wires. Especially women like you." "I do not consent to a search," Alexandria said firmly, eyes steady. "I don't need your consent." Colleen's voice dropped to a sneer. "You don't make the rules here." That's where she was wrong. The clippers clicked on. Alexandria remained seated, her spine straight, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Every buzz, every curl falling to the floor was not just hair, it was memory. Her mother brushing those curls while telling her stories of Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, Angela Davis. Stories of strength and resistance. Stories Alexandria had carried with her every day into court. And now this, a punishment not born of law but of ego and hatred. The moment Colleen kicked a silver curl across the floor like discarded trash, the story changed. This was no longer about a random check. This was an assault of identity, a theft of dignity. And it would not end here. When Colleen was done, she looked proud, like an artist admiring her work. "Looks better now," she sneered, throwing Alexandria's badge on the table. "Courtroom's that way. Try not to be late." Alexandria rose. Slowly. Silently. She didn't touch her head. Didn't pick up the fallen strands. She took her badge, placed it back in her bag, and walked toward the courtroom with a poise that would later be described by many as unnatural. But there was nothing unnatural about it. It was the calm before the storm. Because what Colleen didn't know, what no one in that hallway realized, was that the woman she had just humiliated wasn't a visitor. She wasn't a lawyer. She was the presiding federal judge of Courtroom 3B. And she was about to make history. The heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 3B stood before her, polished to a shine that seemed to reflect not just light, but the weight of tradition, power, and history. Alexandria paused for only a breath, her fingers grazing the edge of the handle, the cool metal biting against skin that still stung from invisible wounds. She pushed the door open. No one noticed her at first. Inside the air was still. Rows of legal representatives, plaintiffs, defense attorneys, and a handful of journalists milled about, shuffling papers and murmuring quietly. The morning's docket had already begun to stir interest, especially with the case of police misconduct being heard today, one involving repeated complaints against courthouse security procedures and racial profiling. They didn't know that the very embodiment of that case had just walked through the door. Alexandria's steps were slow, deliberate. Her head was uncovered, bald, freshly scraped, the rawness of her scalp a visible wound that no one could explain. But they felt it. Like a quiet explosion in a crowded room, her presence shattered the illusion of normalcy. One by one heads turned. Mouths opened. Murmurs stopped. A paralegal dropped his notepad. A defense attorney stood frozen, half-risen from his chair. A junior associate at the plaintiff's table leaned toward her supervisor and whispered, "Is that?" It was. At the defendant's table, Deputy Chief Colleen Briggs stood straight, flanked by two uniformed colleagues. She was speaking with her attorney when the room shifted. Something in the air. A ripple of awareness. And then she turned. Her breath caught. For the first time in her career, Colleen froze not from hesitation, but from the unmistakable grip of fear. Because the woman she had humiliated, shorn of her dignity in a windowless room just minutes earlier, was now ascending the judge's bench. And everyone could see it. Alexandria didn't speak. She didn't need to. She reached for the black judge's robe draped over the back of her chair, the same chair she had presided from for over a decade. The robe unfurled in her hands like justice itself, wrapping her in quiet authority. She didn't fix her hair, there was none. She didn't glance toward Colleen, she didn't need to. Her mere presence was judgment. She sat. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete, so total, it felt sacred. The court clerk, Jasmine, visibly shaken, stood slowly. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but her voice trembled only slightly. "All rise," she said. But everyone already had. Out of shock. Out of reverence. Out of something that transcended courtroom etiquette. Judge Alexandria Rhodess nodded once. Her voice, when it came, was even, deep, and cold as a winter wind slicing through the illusion of safety. "Be seated." No one moved. She looked directly at the defense table where Colleen stood, her face pale, her hand twitching at her side. "We will now proceed with case number 487L, a federal public hearing on systemic abuse of power by courthouse security staff and related law enforcement officials." A pin could have dropped on the courtroom carpet and sounded like thunder. From the witness stand, the plaintiff's first representative, an elderly veteran with a braced arm, shifted nervously as Alexandria nodded in his direction. He didn't seem to know whether to speak or to ask a question. He stared at her shaved head, and something in his expression shifted, shock melting into understanding. And then he bowed his head. He began to speak. Slowly at first, then stronger, recounting how he had once been slammed to the ground in front of the courthouse steps for holding a sign that read "Justice is Patriotism." Alexandria didn't flinch. She listened. Her pen moved steadily, not missing a word. But behind her steel gaze, a storm was brewing. The second witness, a college student, described being tackled by two officers and pinned to the hood of a patrol car simply for filming an unlawful arrest. Her voice cracked. She was only 23. Alexandria looked up at her, then toward the defense table again. Their eyes met. This time it wasn't a warning. It was a reckoning. Colleen Briggs turned away, her jaw tight. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something, but she didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the polished floor beneath her boots, as if trying to disappear into the marble. During a brief recess, the courtroom emptied slowly, people needing air, needing to digest the shift they'd just witnessed. But Alexandria remained at the bench. Silent. Immovable. Only one person stayed in place across the room, Colleen. She hadn't left. Perhaps couldn't. The clerk returned to her seat. Alexandria turned to her and said simply, "Call Deputy Officer Colleen Briggs to the stand." Pause. Not a single objection. Colleen stood, slow and stiff. Her walk to the stand felt longer than any hallway she'd ever patrolled. She sat, facing the woman she had once dismissed as just another black face without a badge. "Deputy Officer Briggs," Alexandria began. "Please describe the individual you brought into room C this morning for secondary screening." Colleen didn't answer right away. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "She lacked identification," Colleen stammered. "Did you ask for her name?" "No." "Did you verify her identity?" Colleen hesitated. "I assumed." "Exactly," Alexandria interrupted. "You assumed." Her voice never rose. But the words rang like a hammer on cold stone. "Who did you conduct the search on, Officer Briggs?" Silence. "Who did you take into that room, restrain without warrant, and strip of her hair?" Colleen's mouth moved. A whisper barely audible. "You, Your Honor." The admission echoed. Not in volume but in consequence. Alexandria didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She looked down at her notes, then back at Colleen. You didn't know who I was. But you thought you knew what I wasn't. Colleen stared at the floor. Let the record reflect that the defendant has identified Judge Alexandria Rhodess as the subject of this morning's unauthorized and unwarranted detainment, physical coercion, and assault. Jasmine made the note, her fingers trembling on the keyboard. The silence that followed was thick. Heavy. Alive. Officer Briggs, Alexandria said calmly. Do you have anything else to say? Colleen looked up, her voice cracking. I didn't mean. Don't say you didn't mean to, Alexandria cut in. Say the truth. Colleen was silent. The truth is you didn't think you had to care. Because you believed no one would ever call you to account. Not for this. Not ever. She leaned forward, gaze locked. But someone is. The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no shouts. No dramatic gavel bangs. Only silence. A silence that had waited too long. A silence that had found its voice. Colleen Briggs sat hunched on the witness stand, the strong-boned posture that once towered over citizens now buckling under the weight of her own name. Her badge was still pinned to her chest, but it no longer shined with authority, it glared like a scar. The courtroom held its breath, yet Judge Alexandria Rhodess was as steady as marble, eyes fixed on the woman who had, not hours ago, dragged her into the back room like contraband. Alexandria gave no outward sign of triumph. She wasn't here to win. She was here to reveal. You said earlier that you assumed I lacked proper credentials, Alexandria began. Do you believe assumption is sufficient grounds for physical search? Colleen's voice was barely audible. No, Your Honor. Yet you acted on it. Yes. Louder. Yes, Your Honor, Colleen said, and the words dropped into the room like lead weights. Alexandria's fingers tapped the polished oak bench, each tap measured, slow, like seconds on a clock counting down to collapse. And how many other times have you made similar assumptions, Officer Briggs? Colleen froze. I don't know. Alexandria gestured to Jasmine, who slid forward a thick folder, its spine already fraying from use. This file contains 12 prior complaints. 12, Officer Briggs. All dismissed. All suppressed. All buried in the system you believed would never question you. Colleen stared at the folder as if it might ignite in front of her. She didn't reach for it. 10 of those 12 complaints, Alexandria continued, were from black women. 2 were from Muslim women asked to remove their hijabs. 1 was a public school teacher. Another, a 17-year-old girl. And yet somehow they were all dismissed. She flipped open the file, reading from a page without raising her eyes. Subject appeared uncooperative. Subject displayed evasive behavior. Officer acted in accordance with established security practices. Alexandria looked up again. You wrote those phrases, did you not? I did, Colleen replied, more whisper than voice. And today you shaved the head of a sitting federal judge in a locked room without verification, without protocol, and without remorse. Colleen blinked rapidly, her breathing sharp and uneven. Alexandria didn't stop. What if I were not a judge? What if I were just another black woman, nameless and unprotected, passing through your line? Colleen's lip trembled, but she didn't answer. You know what would have happened, Alexandria said softly, because it's already happened before. Because you've done it before. And the only difference now, she paused, letting her words hover, is that the wrong woman walked through your door. The gallery behind them remained silent, but something in the room shifted. An awakening, a rising murmur not of voices but of thought. People were remembering. Faces in the crowd began to change. A former court clerk who'd once filed a complaint and been reprimanded, a retired bailiff whose niece had suffered through similar humiliation, a young reporter whose cousin was arrested for filming police during a traffic stop. Justice wasn't just happening on the bench. It was blooming like wildfire. Alexandria tapped the final page in the file. I move to suspend Officer Briggs immediately and recommend federal charges for civil rights violations and excessive use of power. No one objected. Jasmine's keystrokes echoed like hammer strikes. Even the defense lawyers, 3 white men in expensive suits, didn't raise a hand. They simply sat there, shrinking in their chairs as if the very air had turned against them. Alexandria looked to the court officers. Please escort Officer Briggs from the stand. Colleen didn't resist. The officers moved without hesitation, their touch firm but not cruel. The same door through which she had once pushed Alexandria now became her exit. Shoulders slumped, jaw clenched, steps unsteady. The door closed behind her. And the courtroom, still holding its breath, slowly exhaled. Alexandria didn't move for several seconds. Then, deliberately, she reached beneath the bench and retrieved a slim leather file, the one she had carried through security that morning. She opened it, revealing a neatly typed proposal. "This," she said to the gallery, her voice unwavering, "is the beginning of something far more important than a verdict." The title in clean serif font read, "The Rhodes Reform Act." The room stirred. Reporters leaned forward, pens paused mid-sentence. One of the law students in the back gasped under her breath. It wasn't a trial anymore. It was a movement. Section 1, Alexandria read, requires mandatory unconscious bias training for all courthouse security staff and supervisory personnel. Section 2 creates a multi-tiered anonymous reporting system to bypass internal interference. She continued, laying out every clause, every safeguard, every lock she planned to install on the doors where injustice had once slipped through freely. Section 5, she said firmly, reopens all dismissed complaints from the last 10 years, every last one. No exceptions. Not anymore. The courtroom was silent, but outside, the buzz had begun. Through the tall windows of Courtroom 3B, people had started to gather. Students, veterans, mothers, former plaintiffs, court workers. Some carried signs. Others just stood quietly watching. A few clutched old folders, dismissed cases, dusty records they'd been told to forget. From where she sat, Alexandria could see them. But what made her pause was not the crowd. It was the girl. 16, perhaps younger. A fresh scar cut across her cheekbone, barely healing. Her head was shaved, her eyes filled with defiance and awe. She wasn't holding a sign. She didn't need to. Alexandria met her gaze through the glass. And in that moment she understood. She hadn't just punished a corrupt officer. She had made someone believe justice could breathe again. By midday, Lexington Federal Courthouse no longer resembled its usual self. What was once a sterile symbol of old authority had become the beating heart of a civic reckoning. Outside, more people gathered by the hour. No chants, no bullhorns, no chaos. Just presence. A quiet flood of faces who had once been told to keep quiet, who had been made to feel invisible. Today they stood tall and they were watching. Inside, Judge Alexandria Rhodess returned to the courtroom after a brief recess. She was alone when she stepped behind the bench. No robe now, just her shaved head catching the soft glint of light from the stained-glass dome above. Every scratch, every patch of raw skin on her scalp spoke louder than a gavel ever could. As the gallery slowly filled, Alexandria remained seated, reading from her file, making notes in the margin with precise, sharp lines. The buzz of low voices gave way to silence as word spread that she was back. There was no announcement. No bailiff call. Yet all rose to their feet when she looked up. "Be seated," she said calmly. This time, everyone obeyed, not out of obligation but out of respect. Deputy Officer Colleen Briggs had not returned to the defendant's bench. Instead, 2 federal judicial officers escorted her back into the courtroom, no longer in uniform but in an orange prison jumpsuit that seemed to cling to her like an indictment in fabric form. Her hair was still tied, but her posture, so defiant earlier that morning, had melted into something unrecognizable. No badge. No sidearm. No shield. Only exposure. Colleen stood before the judge's bench, eyes downcast, wrists already bound in cuffs. Judge Rhodess looked directly at her, not with vengeance, but with clarity. "This court," she began, "has reviewed the surveillance footage, testimony, prior complaints, and internal documentation. Based on the evidence submitted and the defendant's own admission." Colleen flinched. "We find that Deputy Chief Colleen Briggs is guilty on 3 counts: abuse of power under color of law, violation of federal civil rights, and obstruction of justice through falsification and suppression of complaints." The words hit the courtroom like thunder without sound. No gasps, no applause. Just a ripple of realization, heavy and slow. The court clerk stood to record the sentence. "For abuse of power," Alexandria continued, "the defendant is sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. For violation of civil rights with racially motivated misconduct, 5 years. For obstruction of justice, including the destruction of evidence and intimidation of witnesses, 1 year." Colleen's mouth moved but no words came. Alexandria leaned forward slightly. "That is the legal sentence. Now I will speak to the deeper matter." The room tightened. "You spent 18 years behind the shield of authority, Officer Briggs. You used your position not to serve but to sort, deciding who deserved dignity and who did not based on the curl of their hair, the shade of their skin, the direction of their prayer." Colleen finally looked up, eyes bloodshot, lips trembling. "You shaved my head not to protect anyone but to punish me. To remind me of what you thought I was not. You didn't know I was a judge, but that's not the point. Because if I had not been, I would have walked away broken like the women before me. Like Miss Fatima Khalid. Like Leona Price. Like the pregnant mother you forced to the floor because her brace looked suspicious. The names cut like glass. You thought you had the right to choose who mattered. Alexandria stood. But here's the truth. You never had that right. And now you never will again. She turned to the officers. Remove her. No dramatics followed. No protests. No last-minute pleas. Just the quiet shuffle of feet and the cold clink of handcuffs as Colleen Briggs was led away, the badge she once used as armor now nothing more than a memory she could never wear again. When the door shut behind her, it felt like something more than justice had been sealed. It felt like a new room had opened, one where truth could finally echo. Judge Rhodess sat once again, hands steady on the desk. Her voice did not waver as she turned to address the gallery. We must now face what allowed this to happen. She opened the gray-bound file and lifted it for all to see. The Roads Reform Act is hereby entered into federal court record and submitted for emergency review. She read through the proposals. Mandatory bias training, body cameras in all screening rooms, external review boards, anonymous complaint systems, and retroactive investigations of dismissed cases. The audience listened like students hearing a new language, one they'd always wanted to learn but were never allowed to speak aloud. From the back of the courtroom, a young black man in a charcoal suit rose. His name was Marcus Green, a junior law clerk, barely 25. He had watched his sister endure public humiliation years earlier, a complaint that never made it past internal HR. He raised his hand. Alexandria nodded. Your Honor, he said, voice hoarse, how do we ensure this doesn't fade? Alexandria didn't answer right away. She studied his face, then looked out across the room. Every seat was full. No one was fidgeting. No one was checking the time. Even the most jaded lawyers sat forward. She smiled, barely, but it was real. By remembering, she said simply, that silence is how injustice survives. And stories, real stories, are how we kill that silence. Her gaze found Marcus again. You don't wait for permission. You speak. You write. You act. And when you're tired, you rest, but you don't stop. Outside the courtroom, a ripple of applause began. It wasn't raucous. It was reverent. Gentle. Like church. Judge Rhodess closed the file, but the story was far from over. Because by the time the courthouse doors opened, and the reporters flooded out with headlines already forming, the Roads Reform Act was already in motion. And the judge with the shaved head had already become more than a name on a docket. She had become a symbol. The next morning, the Lexington skyline blinked awake under a rising sun that seemed almost reluctant to shine on the courthouse that had once been a monument to silence. Now it stood transformed, not physically but in meaning. The plaque outside still read Federal Court of Lexington, but the people who gathered beneath it whispered a different name. The Rhodes Court. They weren't protesters. They weren't marchers. They were survivors of silence. Black, brown, white, young, old, some came with canes, some with notebooks, many with nothing at all but memory. A quiet line formed. They carried dismissed files, yellowing paperwork, and in some cases handwritten accounts scrawled in shaking script on napkins, receipts, scraps of cardboard. Inside her office on the third floor, Alexandria watched from the window. She was no longer just a judge today. She was a listener. Jasmine entered without knocking, her face tired but glowing. They've already started collecting new testimonies. And the Civil Rights Division from D.C. called. They're requesting full access to the courthouse archives. And they want you on record. Alexandria turned from the window, her voice even. Tell them they'll get more than that. Tell them I want a hearing. Public. Not just on Colleen Briggs. On the system that fed her. Jasmine's lips parted in surprise. You mean the judges, the directors, the HR officials? All of them, Alexandria replied. By noon, word had reached the upper ranks. The Department of Justice had dispatched a delegation. Black SUVs arrived not with sirens, but with sealed folders and tight expressions. One of them, Carlton Devo, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, entered the courthouse conference room with a grim look of someone used to cover-ups. But today the files spoke for themselves. I've never seen anything like this, Devo muttered, placing the thick stack of reopened complaints on the table. These are more than coincidences. These are patterns. Alexandria leaned forward, her hands clasped. Colleen Briggs didn't act alone. Every complaint that vanished had a signature above it. Every silence had an echo. He flipped through the pages, Memos signed by regional HR, rejection letters stamped by deputy administrators, internal emails that question victims' credibility before even hearing their statements. And names. Familiar ones. Judge Paul Barrett, retired last year with honors, had signed off on the suppression of a complaint by a Muslim girl asked to remove her hijab in front of male officers. Troy Halpern, the former deputy chief of security, had dismissed 3 reports on Colleen with the same phrase, lack of sufficient proof, case closed. Mallory Keene, the court's administrative director, had once granted Colleen a commendation for swift screening protocol, just 2 days after she was accused of humiliating a black high school teacher. Alexandria tapped the table once. We don't just remove one bad actor. We tear out the roots. Devo looked at her, then nodded. We'll begin official inquiries. But you understand, this goes higher than your courthouse. I'm counting on it. That afternoon, the first internal hearing was held, not for Colleen Briggs but for those who enabled her. The courtroom was sealed except for court staff, civil rights observers, and Department of Justice representatives. Alexandria didn't wear her robe. She didn't need it. Barrett entered first, stiff and defiant. His white hair still combed with a judge's precision, but his face flushed when he saw her. You're dragging my name into this witch hunt? He spat. I served 35 years. And in those years, Alexandria interrupted, how many complaints did you suppress because the officer in question had a good record? Barrett fell silent. How many victims walked out of your courtroom thinking justice had no ears for them? You're twisting this into something political. Alexandria leaned forward. I'm twisting it into something truthful. She turned to the screen behind her, and a recording played, an audio clip from 2019. A trembling voice, Fatima Khalid's, asking not to remove her hijab in public. The response, cold and familiar, this is America. If you want to wear that, go back home. The room went silent. The name signed at the bottom of the denial, Paul Barrett. By the time Barrett left the room, his former colleagues couldn't meet his eye. Next came Halpern and Keene, each carrying folders, prepared with defenses. None of them mattered. Because Alexandria had names, records, witnesses. Jasmine had coordinated quietly with a team of law students who'd been archiving forgotten cases. Victims long thought silenced had been contacted. Several had returned, some in person, some via video. Their testimonies were steady, painful, brutal. A mother whose disabled son was frisked so hard he bruised. A Somali man forced to remove his turban at security while white men passed through unchecked. A trans woman laughed at during a pat-down. Each of their reports had once been dismissed with the phrase, insufficient corroboration. But now they weren't alone. And when Alexandria read their names into the official court record, one by one their dignity was restored, not by law but by being heard. The courtroom was quiet as she closed the final folder. This is not about vengeance, she said. It's about excavation. About digging up every stone we once chose not to turn. Then came the moment that would later be aired nationwide. Alexandria stood and held up a sheet of paper, crisp and white. This, she said, is a petition to expand the Roads Reform Act into a national model. Gasp. Some whispered. Others froze. It will go before the federal circuit, she continued. Not just for Lexington but for every courthouse in the United States. The room stirred. Lawyers turned to each other. Court staff nodded silently. This is the reckoning you thought would never come, she said, her voice low but fierce. But it is not a revolution. It's a restoration. Outside the crowds were still growing. And inside, the woman whose hair had been stripped to shame her had now stripped the shame from justice. Not with anger, but with truth. 2 days after the conviction of Colleen Briggs, the Lexington Federal Courthouse found itself at the epicenter of something greater than a local scandal. It was now ground zero for a national shift in consciousness. Headlines on every major network had replaced typical outrage cycles with stunned attention. Judge shaved, judge rises. Humiliation in Room C, justice reclaimed in Courtroom 3B. The Rhodes Act, a quiet revolution begins. But inside the courthouse, Alexandria Rhodess refused to become a spectacle. She didn't pose for cameras, didn't hold press conferences, and didn't allow anyone to turn her story into a political football. Her focus wasn't on vengeance. It was on accountability. The Department of Justice had now fully launched its investigation. By the morning of the third day, subpoenas were being issued, not just to courthouse security, but to regional administrators, record keepers, HR directors, anyone who had touched or buried a complaint. The paper trail didn't just expose individuals, it revealed a culture, a pattern, a design. One complaint vanished because it lacked a signature. Another because the footage was incomplete. A third dismissed because the officer in question maintained a clean performance review. Each lie now stood naked before the truth. By midday, Alexandria convened another session. This time, not a trial but an open hearing. The gallery was packed with students, former plaintiffs, activists, quiet citizens who had never once believed a federal courtroom would be a space where their voices mattered. Alexandria took the bench without her robe again. Her shaved head had already become a symbol of resilience. A scar shone proudly. "I have called this hearing," she began, "to allow those whose voices were once suppressed by this very institution to now speak freely, publicly, and without interruption." She nodded to Jasmine, who motioned to the doors. One by one they entered. First, a woman in her 70s walking slowly with a cane. Her name was Dolores Mitchell, and decades earlier she had been asked to remove her wig, used to cover her alopecia, during a security search. It had been torn from her head by a young officer who said, "You could be hiding something under there." No one had ever apologized. "I never filed a complaint," Dolores said, her voice cracking but steady, "because I didn't think anyone would listen. But now, I see that someone is finally willing to hear what was done to us." Next came a Latina mother named Ana Rivera. She had once tried to enter the building to attend her brother's sentencing, only to be told her toddler's cries were disruptive, and she was escorted out by two officers, one of them Colleen Briggs. "My brother didn't see a single familiar face that day," she said. "He thought we abandoned him." A Middle Eastern man, a Sikh, described being forced to remove his turban at the checkpoint. "They said it was procedure," he recalled. "But I watched 3 white men walk through with baseball caps. None of these were isolated incidents. None of them were documented properly. None had been considered severe at the time. But now, one by one, each story was etched into the federal record." Alexandria didn't speak much during these testimonies. She only wrote and listened, and let them know, by her presence alone, that silence would not return. By late afternoon, an unexpected figure walked through the courtroom doors. The teenage girl. The one who had first appeared in the crowd on the day of Alexandria's silent return to the bench. The one who had shaved her head in solidarity. She didn't approach the mic at first. She stood frozen, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. Jasmine gently nodded at her from across the room. Alexandria looked up and offered the smallest of nods. The girl stepped forward. "My name is Nadia Moore. I'm 16. I'm not a plaintiff. I was never dragged into a room or searched or insulted." She paused. "But I've seen it happen to my mom, my cousin, my teacher. I didn't think anything could change that." She looked directly at Alexandria. "Until you did." Alexandria's throat tightened, but she said nothing. "I shaved my head because I realized something," Nadia continued. "The power they take from us isn't in the hair or the badge or the paperwork. It's in the silence. And you showed me that silence can be broken." The room was still. Not out of fear now but reverence. And Alexandria realized in that moment that justice wasn't just a courtroom matter anymore. It had crossed into lives, into hearts. That evening, as dusk painted the courthouse windows in amber and blue, Alexandria stood once more at the high bench. This time, she faced not a defendant, but a crowd of citizens waiting to see what would happen next. She raised the Rhodes Reform Act. "This document is no longer a proposal," she said. "It is a call. To every federal court, to every civil office, to every institution that has turned a blind eye in the name of tradition, efficiency, or fear." She paused. "From this moment forward, any voice brought before this bench will not be measured by the whiteness of its uniform, the clarity of its documentation, or the volume of its protest. It will be measured by its truth. And it will be heard." The final clause of the Rhodes Reform Act was now added. All dismissed complaints from the past 20 years would be reopened. Not by internal review, but by an independent oversight board formed by civil rights attorneys, retired judges, and members of affected communities. No more internal silence. The crowd rose in unison. Not because they were told, but because they finally believed that justice wasn't just a word. It was a woman with a shaved head who had turned her own humiliation into the first brick of a better system. And they stood not to honor her, but to stand with her. The morning after the Rhodes Reform Act passed in Lexington, the courthouse steps looked different. Not because of banners or marching lines but because of the people who stood there, not with demands but with dignity. A young man in scrubs brought coffee to volunteers collecting testimonies. An elderly black woman sat quietly on the marble steps with a sign that read, "Today, someone listened." Near the edge of the square, a little boy tugged at his mother's hand and pointed to a mural being painted across the courthouse wall, bold colors forming the image of a woman's silhouette, head shaved, spine unbent, eyes full of flame. Inside, Judge Alexandria Rhodess sat at her desk, not reading a file, not reviewing a motion, but simply staring at a blank page. Not out of uncertainty, but from the weight of clarity. Jasmine entered, holding a thick envelope. "They've sent the national petition," she said. 10 other courts have already signed on. 2 more are debating it by week's end. Alexandria took the envelope. She didn't open it. "They're asking," Jasmine added, "if you'll address Congress when the national hearing is scheduled." Alexandria looked up. "Only if I can take every story with me." "You won't need to," Jasmine said. "They're already following you." Outside, networks had begun filming from the square not to chase scandal, but to document something rare. Reform not born from slogans or elections but from lived truth. The New York Times dubbed it the Lexington turning point. The Atlantic called her the judge who wouldn't stay silent. But Alexandria refused every interview. Her message had already been spoken. That afternoon the courtroom filled again. Not for a trial, but for something no one had expected, a formal sentencing ceremony not for an individual, but for a system. In the gallery sat survivors and officials alike. Those who had been silenced and those who once did the silencing. At the bench stood Alexandria. No robe. No folder. Just her voice. "This courtroom has seen trials. But what we conduct today is not a punishment. It is an acknowledgement. That for years justice was defined by the powerful. And that definition was flawed." She paused, her gaze sweeping the gallery. For every person told they didn't look the part. For every parent turned away. For every teacher, student, mother, immigrant, protester, child who walked into these halls and left with less dignity than they arrived with, "Today is your record." She gestured toward the clerk. "Let the final clause of the Rhodes Act be entered into the federal record." Jasmine rose and read aloud, "In all present and future courtrooms under federal jurisdiction, power shall not be presumed by appearance, rank, or uniform but proven by conduct. No individual shall be subject to discretionary searches without full documentation and direct oversight. All dismissed or unprocessed complaints over the past 2 decades shall be reopened and made public record within 1 calendar year. The failure to do so shall constitute grounds for federal inquiry." The courtroom was still. Then, slowly the sound began, not applause, not shouting. It was breath. A collective exhale that filled the space with life. Outside the courthouse, people had begun reading sections of the act aloud through portable microphones, each voice echoing not just law but liberation. Among them stood the girl, Nadia Moore, her shaved head catching the sunlight like a badge. She didn't speak. She just stood in front of the mural now complete, her arms crossed, her eyes on the courthouse steps. Alexandria saw her from the window. Their eyes met. And in that silent exchange the circle closed. She left the bench and walked out, through the back hallway, past the walls that once hid injustice, now lit by murals, framed stories, and the beginnings of a new chapter. As she stepped into the crowd, the sea of people parted. Not because she was a judge, but because she had become something greater. A reminder of what happens when power meets truth. An elderly man stepped forward, Joseph Banner, the veteran who had once testified about being thrown to the sidewalk like trash. He took her hand and whispered, "It's no longer just your courtroom. It's ours now." Alexandria nodded, eyes glassy but unbroken. "It always was." Later that evening, as the courthouse emptied and the steps returned to stone, Alexandria sat alone in her office. The lights were dim, the sky outside burning orange with dusk. She picked up her mirror, small, oval, a gift from her mother. She looked at her scalp. The patches had started to heal. But she didn't reach for a wig. She didn't flinch. Because this wasn't a wand anymore. It was her crown. She placed the mirror down and opened the file she had refused to touch all day. The original dismissal notice from her own incident, drafted automatically that morning before anyone knew who she was. Read. Subject was uncooperative. Procedure followed. No further action required. She scratched one bold line through the center. Then she wrote across it, "Record corrected. Justice heard." And closed the file forever. Some stories end with a verdict. This one begins with it. Judge Alexandria Rhodess turned humiliation into transformation, proving that when justice is silenced, it doesn't die, it waits. And when it rises, it brings with it every unheard voice, every buried file, every person told they didn't belong. Justice, when stripped bare, doesn't vanish. It becomes stronger. And sometimes the most powerful sentence doesn't come from the law. It comes from someone who dares to say, "You don't get to decide my worth." This story moved you? Share it. Let the silence end here. Subscribe to True Echo for more stories that demand to be heard. Leave your thoughts below. What does real justice look like to you?